This lecture is entitled Inigo Jones and Palladianism in English Baroque Architecture, or There Was a Baroque in England? Now, Inigo Jones, who you see here on the left, is a portrait of Inigo Jones, was a really important figure in English architecture in the Baroque period, but also he had a lasting impact on the architecture of England. Now, I said here there was a Baroque in England because you may wonder what was going on in England at the time. We're in the 17th century, right? So this is the 17th century, and you may associate this period in England with literature. And certainly literature was booming in England in the 17th century. And we really haven't looked at a lot of, or really any painting in England. And a lot of the Netherlandish paintings that are famous from this period are actually of the English. So we know that in England, Flemish and Dutch paintings were very much admired and patronized. So Flemish and Dutch painting preferred. And in fact, this portrait of Inigo Jones is created from copying a Flemish portrait of the artist. In terms of painting, the Baroque in England really did rely heavily on Flemish and Dutch art to a large extent. But it's in architecture that the English Baroque really had its own voice. And just to get a sense of where we are in terms of English architecture at the time, let's take a look at an example of a building from the late 16th century. All right, so this building is Hardwick Hall. Hardwick Hall. And it's from the 1590s. And this is a pretty representative example of the prevailing style of English architecture before the contributions of Inigo Jones and other Baroque architects in England. And you can see it's a combination of medieval and Renaissance styles. I mean, we have this vertical emphasis that's a holdover from the medieval period, these towers. And then it's got a few kind of contemporary updates, but there's nothing really obviously classical about this. So let's put it this way. Nothing really classical going on in this building. And if you consider that this was the standard of English Baroque architecture, the contributions of Inigo Jones are all the more striking. So let's take a look at his most famous building now. Okay, so this is generally considered his most famous piece of architecture, and it's known as the Banqueting House. Banqueting House, and it is at Whitehall Palace. It's in London, and it dates 1619 to 22. And keeping in mind the building we just looked at, Hardwick Hall, hopefully this will really jump out at you as a really classical looking building. And I think you can see right away we've got all of the familiar classical elements. We have pilasters, we have engaged columns, we have strong horizontal entablatures, a pronounced cornice at the top. We even have these sculptural classical garlands up at the top. Right away, immediately identifiable as a very classical building. And this is no accident, as Inigo Jones was one of the first English architects who traveled to Italy. So he saw classical art in its home location and was really influenced by the classical architecture he saw there, and particularly the work of one Italian Renaissance architect. And that architect is Palladio. And that is where we get the term Palladianism, which I mentioned at the beginning, Palladianism. So he was working very much in the style of Palladio, this architect that he really admired. So let's take a look at this building next to one of Palladio's most famous buildings. Okay, so here on the left again, we have the Banqueting House, which I should mention, by the way, was part of a palace, and it was an important center for royalty. It wasn't just for banquets, it was a reception hall. There were entertainments performed there. So it was an important public space central to the royal court. So the image on the right here is by Palladio, and it's in the town of Vicenza in Italy. And it's known as the Palazzo Chiericati. And you don't need to remember the name of that, but just know that it was a palace in Italy, and it dates from the second half of the 16th century. I think you can see immediately some real similarities between these two buildings. There's this two-story building with a very strong dividing entablature across the center and a strong emphasis on the roof line. In Inigo Jones's, it's this balustrade, and in Palladio's, it's these sculptural features along the roof line. Notice this up here in Inigo Jones's roof line, very similar to the railing along the entablature in Palladio's. We have alternating pointed and curved elements on top of the windows here in Inigo Jones. Same thing going on in Palladio right here. So clearly very specific things borrowed from Palladio, as well as just this overall sense of balance and harmony that you might associate with Renaissance Italy and architecture of the Italian Renaissance. So Inigo Jones then, and again, consider this keeping in mind what was the prevailing style before Inigo Jones, he is really providing a new spark of something new to English architecture. And that spark would really continue with other English Baroque architects, most notably Christopher Wren, Sir Christopher Wren, who's the most famous English Baroque architect. And you'll be learning more about him in the next subunit.